Chapter 25. Mother, Part 1. A half-day trek from the abandoned house to Aberdeen. He approached his childhood home from the south, fearing what he would find. The first thing he noticed was the garden. Clearly, it had not been put to bed before the onset of winter. Rain-rotted vines hugged the stalks of dried corn rows, and here and there misshapen melons lay broken open, their seeded intestines spilling out. Hardy mustard survivors had already bolted in spring's warmth, yellow blossoms rising triumphant above the sad and sagging bush beans. On the porch, the tinderbox was empty, and only an armful of small pine logs lay scattered across the boards. No smoke rose from the chimney. Anxiety seized him. He dashed up the steps, almost tripping on a broken plank, and grasped at the doorknob. The door was locked. Locked. Who ever heard of locking a door? He pounded. Only silence answered. He pulled back the shutters and peered in through the window to the parlor. Mother was sitting in the soft armchair by the cold wood stove, where she often sat. Her hands were gnarled around the 9-patch quilt on her lap, her eyes focused on nothing. Her face was thinner than he remembered. He rapped on the glass. She did not move. The back door, then, by the root cellar. He hastened around the side of the house. This, too, was locked, but only with a hook and eye, and he was able to rattle the knob up and down until the hook jumped out. He stilled his breathing before he entered. The old rocker sat as it always had, facing the wood stove. Johnny lowered himself into it. Mother raised her eyes and looked at him. She did not speak. Neither did he. They sat that way for a long time, eye-locked, like a locked door. He thought maybe she couldn't really see him, but her eyes were clear and focused. Her hair, however, was disheveled, with streaks of gray that hadn't been there before. And her arms were thin, her bony hands knit together. He looked away to the kitchen. There were opened jars, tomatoes perhaps, the fruit separated from the broth. In that moment he heard her voice, brittle like a twig. "Who are you?" A lump rose to his throat. "Mother, I'm your son. I'm Johnny. I've come home." She did not move. She did not blink. Her expression did not change, but her eyes grew reflective like pools, deeper, bluer, and deeper, until from one a bead fell and ran down her cheek. "Where have you been?" "I've been outside, Mother, outside the 4 directions. I've been to the land of chaos and cruelty. I killed a man. I had to. I've been to free land." He didn't know if she understood any of this. He almost hoped she didn't. He barely understood it himself. He watched her as she moved. She seemed to be waking from a trance. She looked around, pulled the quilt to her chin. "I'm cold, Johnny. Build me a fire." On the porch, he tindered a clutch of kindling from some of the loose logs, and he gathered the rest in a bundle under his arm. The sun was getting low and the shadows were long. Back in the house, he found her standing on shaky legs. She watched him silently as he built the fire and fanned it into flames. There was something solid and steadying about the task, an imprint of layered memories insisting themselves with a strength greater than anything that had come after. Countless times he had built a fire with Mother watching. Soon she would say something, as she always did, some remark about the garden or the weather or the phase of the moon. Even so, he was startled when he heard her voice behind him. "Everyone's gone, Johnny." With a thumping heart, he made his reply without turning. "Where do they go?" "Stubblefield, all of them, to work at the mill. I'm the only one left." He closed the firebox and adjusted the back fence until he heard the air whooshing up the chimney flue. He stood and faced her. "The garden hasn't been tilled. What have you been eating?" "What I can find," she replied. "Have you been sick?" "I don't know. I haven't been well." "What about the doctor? Doesn't he visit?" "He went to Stubblefield. All of them. There is no Aberdeen anymore." Johnny grew agitated. He went to the kitchen and threw open the cupboard door. Nothing but a few jars with rusted lids. White flies hovered over the residue in the flour bin. On the tiles, a plate with something that might have once been a potato, now green with mold. When he turned back to her, he noticed behind her, the window by the door, a jigsaw crack was forming just below the crossbeam. He did not ponder his words before he spoke them. "Mother, I'll stay here with you. I'll find help. There must be someone. I'll plant the garden and cut the wood. I'll cook for you. I'll stay with you until you are better." She sat back down in the armchair, not deeply, only on the very edge, like a fragile bird on a perch. A small smile crossed her lips. "Yes, Johnny," she said. "That would be nice." So, Johnny Arcane stayed with Mother through the summer and through the winter that followed, and into the spring after that. That very night he went out in the backwoods and snared a fat brown rabbit. He boiled up a stew, and into the pot he tossed the bolted woody winter greens from the ruined garden. The next morning he dug out the garden and mounded up the refuse into a moldering heap. After first separating out the viable seeds, corms, and fingerlings. With a shovel he turned the patch over and over, breaking the loam from the clay, until the worms appeared and the blackbirds gathered to pluck the worms from the turned soil. Then he dug rows and strung strings over them and planted all the harvested seeds: corn, cabbage, mustard, beans, kale, melons, potatoes, eggplant, ground cherries, onions, shallots and leeks, beets and radishes, carrots, cucumbers. In the afternoon he gathered as much down-dry wood as he could find, and the next day he went out with a single-handed bandsaw and brought down 4 skinny pines, which he logged up and stacked for the beginning of the winter store. In the deep part of the woods he found 3 beehives, abandoned but still rich with crystallized honey. The next morning he baked the last of the winter pears in a honey glaze and set them before Mother at the table. "I'm going out today to explore," he told her. "I'll be back before sundown." just as she had said, he found the small town of Aberdeen deserted and in ruins. But in the granary cellar there were 2 sacks of wheat flour unmolested by weevils, and another of coarse cut oats. And next to them a flatbed cart with 2 metal wheels, one of them bent, as if left by some grudging but benevolent providence to further his purpose. Mother got better. Color returned to her cheeks, and her conversation became more coherent. She talked of inconsequential things. It had always been this way. It's easy to tell a tree frog from a pond frog. Old Mr. Walker used to bring his grindstone over and sharpen these knives, but he died. The knives had belonged to her mother, and no one knows where she got them. The house itself was her own mother's, and she could remember a time as a child when there was no glass in the windows. No one in the known world knows how to make glass, he said when she told him that. All the glass there is comes from a time before, and no one knows who made it. Nonsense, Johnny. There was no time before glass. A full moon after he arrived, he found her one morning emptying the water from the wall sconces and depositing the fire grate ash. You have to honor the 4 directions, Johnny, she said. It's about time you learned that. That day, she went outside for the first time. She examined the garden, running her fingers over the sprouted melon vines and the bean leaves, caressing the tender young corn tassels. When she walked to the edge of the forest, Johnny watched her closely from the porch. She never left his sight. After a while, she came back with a smile on her face. The robins have hatched in the gram oak, she said, and she held out a palm full of blue eggshells. We have to get some chickens, he told her one day. Don't you know anybody? Well, the Carlyles left their chickens behind when they moved to Stubblefield. Maybe they are still there. So that day, Johnny took a burlap sack and walked to the old Carlyle house, or at least where the Carlyle house used to be. It was completely gone. Not like it had burned, more like it had been disassembled and the boards carried off. But sure enough, there were 7 red hens clucking and pecking about in the grass grown over the foundation. He bagged them all, and that night they ate one. The rest they put in the chicken pen, and within a moon they were laying. The days passed, uncounted, and summer rolled in. Johnny set his mind to the task at hand. He needed this. It was like returning to a timeless place before there was anything, a time before glass, when the seasons rolled in and out of the window of the sky, and there were days and nights, and there was food from the garden and the hen house and the occasional wild creature from the forest. And sometimes there were games in the parlor, at the table with barn nails or shells or the charcoal scribblings of runes on bark. And yes, there was music. One evening toward midsummer, Mother brought out the accordion. A bit shyly, or so he thought. Do you still play, Johnny? She asked. They played. Late that night, and all the strathspeys and the cotillions, slipjigs and stovepipes. Mother was surprised he remembered them. I never stopped playing, he told her. He remembered them better than she did, and for good reason, he thought, as he watched her wipe the layer of dust off the accordion with her apron. As always, Mother played with a focus more on form than pleasure, concentrating on the placement of the mordents, the fermatas, the arpeggiaturas. But as the night moved on, her stance relaxed. She leaned into the music, and several times she chuckled at the conclusion of a lively coda. On other nights they didn't play as late, and many nights they didn't play at all. But on nights they did play afterwards, when she was sleeping, he left the house and climbed by lamplight to the top of Gravestone Hill, where Huxley, Vermilion, and Rugchomper were buried. And there he sat and wept. For there is no way the music could not reopen the memories that the work had kept at bay. The nights in the little cabin behind the bathhouse, playing untuned with Lucy, all the melodies tuned and untuned with Bearclaw, Jocko, and Aunt. The times when the music tapped the sorrow of life and turned it to sweetness. And how did he know back then anything at all of the sorrow that was yet to come? In those moments he saw beyond the borders of the four walls of the house, the four directions of the known world, the curved boundaries of free land pushing slowly, gently, insistently into the world of chaos and cruelty. Eventually, in time, as it always happens, the inhaled breath of summer was released. The summer sprites fell in streaks of light from the dark night sky. The leaves of the oaks turned brown, the alders yellow, and a spidery web covered the last of the summer blackberries. Johnny grew restless. It was always this season that made him restless, always. The turning leaves and the morning chill stirred the sojourner in his blood, and it ran through his arms, into his legs, and propelled him to wander the hills in all four directions. A curve in the road ahead, always disappearing, always beckoning. Mother was well now. She had taken on most of the cooking and some of the gardening, while Johnny occupied himself with felling fresh green logs and bringing home the occasional meat from the forest. This gave him much time to roam and ponder. There had been no one else since he had arrived, only Mother. He knew within a day's walking he could find a roadhouse, friendly faces, conversation, but he chose not to. He needed to be close to Mother, to protect her. He feared leaving her even for one night, with the darkness hovering so close outside. So he was alone with these things, and it fueled the fire of his restlessness.